The rain hadn't let up for hours. A cold, misty kind that soaked through coats and skin without ever turning to a proper downpour. I stood at the edge of the cemetery plot, my boots slowly sinking into the soft earth, watching them lower my mother's coffin into the ground. The priest's voice was distant, muffled by the wind and my own thoughts. I heard my name when he mentioned survived by her only daughter, Maya Sharma, but the words felt detached, as though they were meant for someone else. Mom would have hated the weather. She liked clarity, crisp, dry air, the kind that left no ambiguity. But Oregon had given us this instead: gray skies, damp air, and an aching silence that followed me home. Home. That word felt suddenly weightless. I hadn't lived in that house for years, not since law school. But stepping through the front door that afternoon, I realized she'd preserved everything as though I might return at any moment. My high school debate trophies still lined the shelves. The wooden owl I carved in 8th grade still guarded the mantel. In the kitchen, the same copper kettle sat on the stove, its handle worn from her hands. I spent the rest of the day in silence, wandering room to room like a ghost in someone else's memory. I didn't cry. Not yet. There was too much to do: paperwork, estate filings, calls to family members who hadn't spoken to her in years. A familiar rhythm took over, the same one I knew from court prep: organize, prioritize, act. By evening, I found myself in her bedroom closet, not entirely sure what I was looking for. There was a box I remembered from childhood, locked and stashed high on the shelf. She'd always said it was her documents box: birth certificate, immigration papers, things like that. I pulled it down, my fingers trembling slightly, and brought it to the floor. The key was still taped under her jewelry drawer, exactly where she'd always kept it. Inside were folders, envelopes, and a small metal tin. I thumbed through each one, making mental notes. Original birth certificate, yes, I'd need that. Property deeds, social security info, passport. Then something caught my eye. An envelope, yellowed and brittle, marked with a name I didn't recognize: Anika R. No last name. No return address. The handwriting wasn't my mother's, it was sharper, messier. Inside, a second birth certificate. I blinked, checking the name. Mine. Maya Sharma. Same birth date. But the place of birth wasn't Portland. It was Clearwater Bay, British Columbia. And the mother's name wasn't Reena Sharma. It was Anika Rao. I stared at it, waiting for the mistake to correct itself, for the letters to shift back into something familiar. But they didn't. They sat still on the page, calm and certain in their quiet betrayal. I checked the date again. It was exact. The document looked official, registered with the province, with the right stamps and signatures. My eyes darted between the two birth certificates, trying to find an explanation. A clerical error? But the handwriting was different. The formatting, the seal, all authentic. Two documents. One name. Two mothers. I wanted to feel something: anger, confusion, denial, but I just felt numb. A dull cold spread through my limbs, heavier than the Oregon rain outside. I lay both certificates side by side on the floor and sat back against the closet wall. The silence in the house was oppressive now, as if it knew something I didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents as if they might change under the fluorescent light. I tried to recall stories my mother had told me about my birth, but there weren't many. She was always vague. "We had to move quickly after you were born," she once said. Long story, not important. But now it felt very important. In the morning, I drove to the funeral home and asked for her file. The man behind the desk hesitated, but I pressed him, pulling out my bar ID almost reflexively. He relented. The death certificate matched the name I knew: Reena Sharma. No aliases. No Canadian history. Just a woman born in Gujarat, India, who immigrated in the 1980s and died of heart failure in 2025. I didn't mention the second birth certificate. Instead, I left the office and drove out to the coast, where the water met the cliffs in a violent spray. I stood there, wind biting at my coat, trying to reconcile the woman I buried with the one I might never have known. The one named Anika. The one whose name I now carried on a document that said I was born somewhere I'd never been. The only thing I knew for sure was this: My mother had kept a secret, and she had taken most of it to her grave. And now I was going to find out why. The thing about doubt is that it never knocks. It doesn't announce itself with questions or warnings. It arrives quietly, slips into the room with your own breath, and starts rearranging your certainty without asking. That's how it was in the days after I found the second birth certificate. Small, strange shifts in my memory, like furniture I thought I recognized moved just an inch to the left. I didn't immediately jump to conspiracy or abandonment. That would have been too easy, too dramatic. Instead, I went through old photo albums, flipping page after page, looking for clues. I wanted to see if there was a missing piece I hadn't noticed before. But everything looked the same. A woman with sharp eyes and a firm grip on the world, holding a child who had no idea anything was amiss. There were pictures of me as a baby, wrapped in hospital blankets, but none that clearly showed the hospital name. No family in the delivery room. No visitors. Just her. Always her. I called my aunt, Mina, who lived in San Jose now. She was my mother's younger sister, the one we only saw at weddings and holidays, when tradition demanded some version of closeness. She answered on the second ring. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I've been thinking about you." "I'm managing," I said. I had a question. Something odd came up while going through her papers. A pause. "What sort of something?" "I found a second birth certificate. With my name. But it says I was born in Canada. And the mother listed isn't Rena." The line went very quiet. "Mina?" Another pause. "Where in Canada?" "Clearwater Bay, British Columbia." I could hear her breathing change. It wasn't panic. It was that strained kind of stillness that only comes when someone is deciding how much of the truth they're willing to let out. "Did she ever mention that name to you?" I asked. "Anika Rao?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I don't think so. But you recognize it." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Her voice dropped. "Maya, whatever you found, it's old. And if your mother didn't tell you, maybe it wasn't something she wanted to be reopened." That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. That was the end of the call. She wouldn't pick up again for another week. Back in Portland, I sat at the edge of my hotel bed, laptop open, running every variation of the name Anika Rao I could think of. I found hundreds, but nothing that made sense. The pieces didn't connect. I tried birth records, court cases, even environmental activism databases, anything that might explain why someone named Anika Rao had handed me off to Reena Sharma. The more I searched, the more the silence began to suffocate. I took a leave from the firm. Told them I needed time to settle the estate. It wasn't a lie, not really, but I left out the part where I wasn't sure who the estate belonged to anymore. My boss, Henry, didn't press me. I think he could tell I was halfway out the door already, even before the funeral. With time off, I drove to the state records office and requested every document on file for my mother. Immigration forms. Naturalization. Work permits. None of them mentioned children. No adoption records either. Just a single-parent household, built around a woman who didn't leave many footprints behind. But when I pulled her IRS files routine for estate handling, I noticed something strange. Her listed social security number had a change date in 1992. That was the year we moved to Portland when I was about 4. I remember only fragments from that time, a house near the water, the sound of boats in the morning. Then nothing. Just the version of life she built in Oregon. That was the pivot point. Whatever happened, it happened then. I booked a ticket to Vancouver. The customs officer looked at me strangely when I said I didn't know where I was going yet. "Just visiting family," I said, even though I wasn't sure that was true anymore. I rented a car and drove east, out of the city, away from the gleaming skyline and deep into the coastal range. I didn't have a destination. Just a name and a dot on a map. Clearwater Bay wasn't on most GPS systems. I had to ask twice at gas stations before someone pointed me toward a narrow logging road, half swallowed by trees. By late afternoon, I found a faded wooden sign with the name carved in English and Squamish, tilted and half covered by moss. The road narrowed, then opened into a small clearing where a general store and a church stood across from one another like stubborn relics. I parked and walked into the store. A man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. "You're not from here," he said, not unkindly. I'm looking for information, I replied. About someone who may have lived here. A woman named Anika Rao. Maybe around 1990, 1991. He didn't react immediately. Then he folded the paper slowly, set it down, and said, "You should talk to Elsie. Down by the inlet. She remembers everybody." Elsie? Midwife. And the town's memory. I found her in a small cedar house near the water, hanging laundry with practiced hands. Her back was straight despite the years carved into her face. When I introduced myself, she squinted at me for a long time. "You're her," she said. I swallowed. "Whose?" "Anika's girl." That moment landed like a stone in my stomach. Heavier than any evidence or document. Just a simple truth, spoken plainly, as though it were the weather. Elsie invited me in. Made tea. Sat me down. She came here in the late 80s. With fire in her veins. Fought the logging companies. Wouldn't back down. She was lightning in human skin. Then one day, she was gone. And the baby? She left you with a woman. A friend, maybe. Said she was going somewhere dangerous. Said she'd come back. She never did. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Elsie reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. "You deserve to know," she said. "But it won't be easy." I believed her. The road back from Clearwater Bay wound like a ribbon through the trees, dark and damp and endless. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the manila folder I'd stuffed with photocopies from Elsie's house, newspaper clippings, protest leaflets, a grainy black and white photo of a woman mid-speech, hair wild, eyes on fire. Anika. My mother, or at least, the one who had brought me into the world. I didn't need a DNA test. I had her voice in my spine. Elsie had remembered her well. She had too much truth in her for most people, she'd said, pouring more tea. That's a dangerous thing around here. Especially back then. I thought about that as I drove south, retracing steps that had never been mine. Anika had vanished sometime in 1992. Not declared missing, just gone. No body, no police report, no obituary. According to Elsie, the last anyone had heard, she'd been in some kind of legal trouble tied to a protest blockade near the Skeena River. The story didn't make national headlines, but there were whispers, corporate interference, land grabs, threats made in quiet meetings. That's where the trail led. By the time I got to Prince Rupert, the clouds had settled in like a second skin. Everything smelled of salt and cedar and the iron of wet earth. I checked into a motel near the harbor and spread out the contents of the folder across the bed, next to my laptop. My mind was buzzing, not with certainty, but with the methodical rhythm of a case forming. And that was how I had to approach this, not as a daughter chasing ghosts, but as a lawyer looking for missing pieces in a file. I dug into court records first. British Columbia's public access system was clunky, but familiar enough to navigate. I searched for environmental protest cases between 1990 and 1995, narrowing the parameters until the screen populated with a short list. One stood out immediately: Province of British Columbia versus Unknown Defendants, 1992. Location: Kitimat, Stikine District. I opened the docket. The summary was vague, but it mentioned an injunction granted to a timber company, Rothman Logging Group, against an encampment of environmental activists and members of the Tahltan Nation who were blocking access to a proposed logging site. Trespassing, interference with commercial activity, civil disobedience. It fit. There were affidavits, testimonies from company reps, blurry photographs entered as evidence. And there, tucked in the margins of the scanned exhibits, was a name: Anika Rao. Identified only once, in a memo from the company's legal team. Described as a recurring agitator with external influence, no fixed address. I sat back and stared at the screen. My hands were cold. Rothman Logging Group. It wasn't a name I recognized from Oregon, but the surname tugged at something. I jotted it down and started a new search. The company no longer existed under that name. It had been absorbed in the early 2000s by a corporate entity called Coastal Dominion Resources, based out of Vancouver. And Coastal Dominion's legal counsel of record for the last 2 decades? Caleb Rothman. The moment I saw the headshot, I knew. He had the kind of face that held power like it was currency: clean suit, clipped silver hair, a smile too polite to trust. I remembered him vaguely from bar events, though we'd never spoken directly. He was a name whispered in coastal litigation circles, known for outmaneuvering environmental protections with surgical precision. And now, it seemed, he had a history with my mother. A history buried deep in a forgotten land rights case from over 30 years ago. The deeper I dug, the more familiar it all began to feel. Corporations bypassing indigenous consultation. Environmental reviews rubber-stamped. Land leases executed with incomplete documentation. As an environmental attorney, I'd built my career identifying these patterns. But this wasn't just another case. This was personal. And I was far enough in now that turning away would have meant leaving part of myself behind. The next morning, I drove to Terrace, a town built on industry and stitched together by generations of unspoken compromise. The local archives were modest but well-maintained. I asked the clerk if there were any physical files related to the 1992 blockade or protests in the Skeena River Valley. She raised an eyebrow but led me to a back room filled with file boxes. Hours passed. Dust settled on my sleeves. I found minutes from town hall meetings, internal memos from the local forestry department, and one particularly damning folder: communication logs between Rothman Logging Group and the regional government. In one letter, dated March 1992, a government official expressed concern about escalating tensions with protesters, including foreign-born activists, and urged Rothman's team to expedite all lawful remedies and maintain containment optics. The phrase clung to me like a splinter. Containment optics. Not justice. Not resolution. Just appearance. There was no record of Anika's arrest. No official charges. But that didn't surprise me. It was easier, in those days, to disappear someone with bureaucracy than with force. You just let the paperwork run out and wait for the story to fade. But Anika hadn't faded completely. She had left behind a trail. A fragile one, but enough. And at the end of that trail, it seemed, was a man who had spent decades profiting from the very systems she tried to expose. I drove back to Vancouver in silence. There was a new shape to this now, not just a mystery, but a legal puzzle. If Rothman had been involved in misconduct during those early years, fraudulent filings, suppressed land claims, procedural violations, it could affect Coastal Dominion's current holdings. And if I could prove a pattern of abuse, maybe even tie it to my mother's disappearance, there would be leverage. Not just for me, but for the communities still fighting the same battles today. That night, I stood by the window in my hotel room, watching the city lights flicker in the fog. The air smelled different here, like metal and promise. I thought of my mother, the one who raised me, and the one I was only beginning to understand. What had she given up to protect me? What had she seen that made her trust a life of silence over the risk of truth? I had questions. But more than that, I had tools. Training. Patience. Procedure. And I was going to use them. I first saw Caleb Rothman in person a week later, across a polished wood conference table in downtown Vancouver. Coastal Dominion was holding a public consultation on its new expansion proposal, technically voluntary, though the optics mattered. I wasn't on the list of speakers, but that didn't matter. I knew how to dress for these rooms, how to walk in with just enough confidence to avoid being asked for credentials. It helped that I was one of the few in the crowd not clutching a protest sign or flyer. Rothman sat at the head of the table like a man auditioning for a role he'd already been cast in. Everything about him was crisp: steel gray suit, monogrammed cufflinks, hair combed with geometric precision. He exuded the kind of cultivated civility that made people forget he was the sharpest weapon in the room. He was midway through a presentation on ecological offsets when he glanced up and saw me. His smile didn't break, but I noticed the pause. Barely half a second. Recognition, maybe. Or curiosity. I didn't look away. After the session, as the room dissolved into pockets of handshakes and polite evasions, I waited. Not near the table, just close enough to be noticed. He came to me, of course. "You're not with the media," he said, extending a hand. "Or if you are, you hide it well." "Environmental law," I replied, shaking his hand. "Freelance advisory." "Maya Sharma." He raised an eyebrow. "American." "Oregon." His grip was firm, practiced. Caleb Rothman. Though I imagine you already knew that. I smiled. It's a small industry. That amused him. It used to be. Not so much anymore. He motioned to a quieter corner, and we walked, his steps deliberate, voice low. So, he said, what brings an Oregon lawyer to a sleepy little land use meeting in British Columbia? I shrugged. Curiosity. Dangerous trait. Only to the incurious. That got a chuckle. You came a long way just to be curious. There's a pattern I've been following. Land acquisitions, procedural irregularities, impact studies that mysteriously vanish between draft and final reports. His eyes narrowed, just a touch. That sounds like a very determined curiosity. I'm thorough. He nodded. You know, we get activists here all the time. Idealists. The kind who think paperwork is violence and capitalism a personal insult. I'm not an activist. No, he said, clearly not believing me. Then what are you? Someone who reads the footnotes. For a moment, the air between us stilled. His face remained pleasant, but I could feel the shift. He knew I wasn't just browsing. He just didn't know how much I knew or why I was really here. Well, he said, resetting his tone, I do hope you enjoy your stay. The coast is beautiful this time of year. But do be careful. The wilderness here has a way of swallowing people. It was subtle, polished. A warning dressed as weather talk. I met his eyes. So does corruption. He smiled at that, as if we were sparring for sport. I like you, Miss Sharma. You're sharp. But you're not the first sharp person who's tried to poke around in things better left archived. Some questions don't come with clean answers. And some documents stay missing for a reason. Luckily, I said, I'm patient. He gave a slight bow. All the best, then. We parted with the formality of diplomats, but I felt the adrenaline for hours after. Not fear, just the taut awareness that I had finally met the person who had the most to lose from my persistence. Back in my hotel room, I laid out everything I had again. The company's evolution from Rothman logging to coastal dominion. The skeletal remains of the 1992 blockade case. Anika's name, mentioned only once, in a buried memo. My own birth certificate, still folded in my wallet like a secret note passed in class. Rothman hadn't confirmed anything, but he hadn't denied it either. He'd spoken like a man who assumed the system would keep protecting him, like it always had. I knew that posture. I'd argued against it in courtrooms from Salem to Seattle. Men who confused polish for innocence. Men who built walls from policy and called it due process. But something else lingered too. Not just arrogance, calculation. He didn't think I had enough. Not yet. He was still gambling on the silence holding. That was his mistake. Because I'd been trained in how to speak softly and file loudly. I'd always believed there were two kinds of silence, the kind you choose and the kind forced on you. In law, we see both. Clients who refuse to speak for fear of retaliation, and others who stay quiet because the truth would break them. But this was a silence I hadn't prepared for. The silence between who I thought I was and who I might be. After my encounter with Rothman, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been seen, not as a threat, but as a curiosity. He didn't fear me. Not yet. That settled over me like a challenge. If I wanted answers, real ones, I had to shift from observer to participant. I had to stake a claim, legally and emotionally. And that meant making a choice. I returned to Clearwater Bay one last time. The trees arched over the road like sentinels, and the sky held that still, bluish gray that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. Elsie met me at her front door before I even knocked. I knew you'd come back, she said. You've got that restless look. I need to know everything, I told her. Not just what happened to Anika. I need to know what she believed was worth dying for. Elsie didn't argue. Instead, she took a box from the hallway and set it gently on the kitchen table. It was battered and soft at the edges, but neatly labeled in Anika's handwriting, Forest Sovereignty, 1991-92. Inside were journals, maps, photos of logging roads cut into dense forest, and legal drafts, reams of notes about indigenous land rights, sovereignty clauses in colonial-era treaties, and federal land trust violations. Her pen bled urgency into every page. She wasn't just passionate. She was surgical. She wrote like someone preparing for war by way of court filings. But what struck me most wasn't the strategy. It was the despair in the margins. Scrawled comments in sharp pen, no one's listening. Courts dismissing on jurisdiction. Government stalling on purpose. I'm drowning in their red tape. I recognized that feeling. Later that evening, I sat at the edge of the lake, the water perfectly still except where fish broke the surface. The folder sat next to me. I stared at her words, trying to imagine what it felt like to pour your life into something so fragile, knowing that one missing form or procedural delay could erase everything. She'd been brilliant, careful, and it hadn't been enough. That's what broke me. Not the betrayal. Not the lies. The futility. I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not because she'd left me, but because I finally understood why. She hadn't abandoned me. She'd protected me from the world that swallowed her whole. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to chase ghosts anymore. I was going to finish what she started. Not through protest, not through spectacle, but through the system itself. The same system that buried her, if only to show it could be turned against itself, page by page. I reached out to the environmental law firm representing the current Indigenous land claim against Coastal Dominion. Their office was tucked into a converted home in Prince George, 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, and a legal assistant who doubled as receptionist and crisis coordinator. I introduced myself as an independent attorney on sabbatical, interested in providing research and strategic support. They were skeptical at first, until I mentioned the 1992 Rothman case. The blockade case, one of the lawyers, Sharon, asked. It's not part of the current record. It should be, I said. And I have documents to prove why. Over the next few days, I shared what I'd gathered, Anika's research, the buried memos, the land maps, the forged surveys. Sharon and her team pulled late nights verifying every page. The atmosphere shifted. Where there had been polite detachment, now there was quiet momentum. I think this could open the door to a procedural review, Sharon said one night, spreading files across the office's old dining room table. If Rothman logging falsified their consultation timeline or misrepresented the land title, then every decision made since becomes contestable, I finished. She nodded. It's not a silver bullet, but it's the beginning of leverage. Still, I hesitated. Even with the case building, something in me resisted going all in. It wasn't doubt about the facts. It was fear of what came after. If we won, if Rothman fell, if the past was exhumed, what would that leave me with? A void filled with truths no one had asked me to find? I sat in the firm's back office one evening, alone, lights low, and dialed Mina's number again. This time, she picked up. You found her, didn't you? She asked softly. Yes. Silence. She didn't die, I said. Not officially. She vanished. There's no record. She knew that would happen, Mina said. She chose to disappear. She begged Rena to take you. Why? Because she knew she was going to lose. Not just the case, the war. And she didn't want you used as a weapon against her. She didn't trust the courts, or the press, or the police. But she trusted Rena. I swallowed. You could have told me. We promised not to. Your mother wanted you to grow up clean. Without the anger. Without the burden. But that's not what happened. No, Mina said. It never is. I ended the call and stared at the wall until the office lights shut off automatically. That was the crossroads. I could walk away, let the past stay buried, except that my life had been a carefully constructed fiction meant to protect me from pain. Or I could walk straight into the fire, armed with evidence, training, and a name that now meant something very different. I chose the fire. The next morning, I filed the formal motion to join the Indigenous legal team as a pro bono advisor. Not as a daughter. Not as a grieving woman looking for closure. But as a lawyer. The first thing you learn in environmental law is that truth doesn't win cases. Procedure does. Truth is messy. It comes wrapped in emotion, memory, hearsay, and politics. Procedure, on the other hand, is clean. It lives in filing dates, statutory language, regulatory thresholds, and timelines that can make or break a case, depending on whether you mailed a document on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. The people who built the system knew this. That's why they made it so labyrinthine, because they could weaponize delay. That's where I came in. My role with the Indigenous legal team wasn't glamorous. I didn't argue in court or make fiery public statements. I sat in the back office, combing through 68 boxes of disclosure and 30 years of corporate filings, one PDF at a time. I logged each land transaction Coastal Dominion had executed since the Rothman merger, color-coded every instance of Indigenous consultation or, more often, the lack of it. I lived off vending machine coffee and carried 3 different highlighters in my coat pocket like talismans. And it paid off. It started with a land lease from 2006. A minor parcel, adjacent to Talton land, labeled non-sensitive. I almost skipped it until I noticed that the environmental impact statement was dated 2 weeks after the lease was approved. That was illegal. Under the Forestry Act, the EIS had to be completed and filed at least 30 days prior to approval. I checked the timestamp metadata on the digital file. Someone had edited the original PDF 4 years later, overriding the initial date with a fake one. It wasn't even subtle. Just lazy. I brought it to Sharon that night. She read the page in silence, then looked up slowly. Is this the only one? I doubt it. We stayed until 2 a.m., tracing other acquisitions. It wasn't just a one-off. There were at least 6 more parcels acquired under similar circumstances, backdated impact assessments, missing consultation logs, forged affidavits from non-existent community meetings. This isn't incompetence, I said. No, Sharon agreed. It's policy. The next morning, we filed a motion to compel Coastal Dominion to release internal memos and email communications relating to those acquisitions. Their lawyers responded with predictable outrage: frivolous, inflammatory, a fishing expedition. But the judge, to his credit, granted partial access. What came back was damning. There were email chains between mid-level executives and Rothman himself, advising them to streamline procedural friction and retrofit compliance language post-decision. That's corporate speak for forging the paperwork later. In one thread, a manager openly asked whether they should run this through the Squawk team or just ghost it. Attached to that email was a draft affidavit from a community liaison who, upon further checking, had died in 2004, 2 years before the document was supposedly signed. Sharon printed that one and pinned it to the office bulletin board. "Welcome to Discovery," she said dryly. We didn't go public with it yet. Not immediately. We needed to build the procedural argument first, ironclad, clinical, undeniable. The kind of case that didn't scream corruption but whispered it into the court's ear until it couldn't look away. And then, almost accidentally, we found the link to the past. It was buried in a footnote from a 1993 audit report. A notation that read, "Initial Rothman timber consultation process unresolved, see file RT 182A. I nearly fell off my chair. That file, according to the archive log, had been marked closed due to insufficient evidence the same week Anika disappeared. We requested it. After several delays and a veiled suggestion from Coastal Dominion's legal team that the file might be incomplete, the records arrived. It included, among other things, a scan of an internal memo written by Rothman's predecessor, referencing non-compliant activist obstruction, and a recommendation that discrete containment efforts be pursued off-record. It also included a redacted list of individuals deemed high risk to project continuation. Name number 4, Anika Rao. There it was. Cold, indirect, but clear. I sat in the empty conference room that night, staring at the memo. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt cold. Like someone had handed me a scalpel made of ice and asked me to keep cutting. Rothman hadn't written the memo himself, but he'd inherited the consequences. He'd built his empire on a foundation that included this file. And now that file was in my hands. We could have gone to the media. We could have leaked it, sparked outrage, won in the court of public opinion. But that wasn't the fight I was waging. I didn't want noise. I wanted law. Quiet, meticulous, enforceable. The next step was filing a procedural challenge that questioned the legitimacy of every subsequent land use permit Coastal Dominion had obtained in the region. That included active logging routes, extraction licenses, and even federal subsidies. If the judge granted it, it would freeze their operations indefinitely, death by injunction. The hearing was set for the following month. I spent the weeks leading up to it in near solitude. I barely left the office. I hardly slept. At night, I dreamt of forests burning, of courtrooms filled with wind. I saw Anika's face in the margins of legal documents, her handwriting woven between clauses. I wasn't naive. I knew Rothman would come back with everything he had: delay tactics, jurisdictional challenges, credibility attacks. And I knew he'd use every inch of procedural ambiguity to grind us down. But I also knew something else. I was better at this than he thought. I wasn't here to take a moral stand. I was here to file, submit, verify, and execute. By the time the morning of the hearing arrived, we had 423 pages of procedural analysis, 97 exhibits, and 12 sworn affidavits. Everything cross-referenced. Everything sourced. It was boring. It was beautiful. And it was about to hit them like a silent avalanche. The first blow came quietly. A letter slid under my hotel room door. No stamp, no envelope. Just a folded sheet of high-quality paper with the firm's insignia embossed in the corner. Coastal Dominion's legal department. Inside, a formal notice of professional misconduct. They were accusing me of a conflict of interest. I read it 3 times. The language was deliberate, bland on the surface, but sharpened underneath. They claimed I had misrepresented personal motivations while offering legal assistance, suggesting I was leveraging the case for a private vendetta tied to my familial connection to a defunct protester. Not Mother. Not Anika Rao. Just a defunct protester. I expected pressure. But I hadn't expected them to reach this far, this fast. I brought the letter to Sharon, who read it silently, jaw tight. "They're laying the groundwork to get you disqualified," she said. "Maybe even sanctioned." Can they? Maybe. If they convince the court that your emotional involvement compromises procedural objectivity. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The next day, someone left a voicemail on the firm's landline pretending to be a journalist. When we returned the call, there was no record of the number. Then, a week later, someone slashed the rear tires on my rental car. No note. No witnesses. Just silence with an edge. I didn't report it. I knew better. Instead, I moved out of my hotel and into a room above the law office. A cot, a desk, a single window that looked out onto a cracked alley. It wasn't comfort I needed, it was containment. Isolation had a way of simplifying things. When I wasn't cataloging exhibits, I stared at the wall, thinking about Rothman's expression that day in Vancouver. How casual he'd seemed. How sure. He wasn't scared of the law. He was scared of exposure. He understood that if we pulled too hard on one thread, the entire garment might come undone. So he pushed back quietly but strategically. Professional threats. Surveillance disguised as coincidence. A whisper campaign that painted me as unstable, grief-blinded, ethically compromised. Even Sharon started fielding calls from donors and concerned supporters asking if it was wise to let an outsider lead the charge. To her credit, she stood by me. But I felt the shift. People started pausing when I entered the room. Voices lowered. Meetings were held without me. A soft ring of distance formed around my chair. I became both necessary and suspect. And yet, I didn't break. Because in the quiet, I remembered why I was there. Not to be liked. Not to be safe. To finish something that had been buried for 30 years. They wanted me rattled. But I'd spent too many years in litigation to flinch at games like these. Let them slash tires. Let them whisper. I still had the law. And I still had the truth. Courtrooms aren't made for drama. Not real ones. They aren't like television, no outbursts, no smoking guns, no gasps from the gallery. Just wooden walls, gray suits, and the rustle of paper. Stillness, mostly. Bureaucratic gravity. But sometimes, if you know what to look for, the drama is in the details. In the shifting of a judge's brow. In the stammer of a seasoned lawyer when a page number catches him off guard. In the way a room can lean ever so slightly in one direction without anyone speaking it aloud. I sat at the petitioner's table, binder open, pen in hand, though I'd memorized every word in our motion. Sharon was beside me, voice calm, eyes locked on the bench. Across the aisle sat Rothman and his team for attorneys, all tailored, all deliberately casual, like men so sure of their foundation they didn't check the footing. We began with the basics. Sharon laid out our motion. A procedural challenge to the permits Coastal Dominion had received post-merger, rooted in violations of environmental review deadlines, falsified consultation records, and fraudulent affidavits. No mention of Anika. No emotion. Just statute and sequence. When she cited the 2006 lease with the backdated environmental impact statement, Rothman didn't flinch. When she presented the forged affidavit signed by a man already dead, he still didn't move. But when she entered into evidence the email chain's streamlined procedural friction, retrofit compliance language post-decision, I saw him blink. Then it was Rothman's turn. He stood, slow and fluid, like a man approaching the witness of his own innocence. "Your Honor," he began, "we do not contest the imperfections noted by petitioner's counsel. Bureaucracies are imperfect machines. But to suggest intentional fraud based on a few isolated inconsistencies is, respectfully, a reach." He smiled. The judge didn't. Rothman continued. "Coastal Dominion operates across hundreds of jurisdictions. It employs thousands. A few clerical errors, tragic as they may be, do not constitute systematic abuse." It was clever. He conceded just enough to appear cooperative, while shifting the conversation toward scale, toward human error rather than corporate intent. But we weren't finished. Sharon nodded toward me, and I stood. My voice didn't shake. "Your Honor, the issue here is not clerical error. It's pattern. It's intent." A lease dated March 14, 2006, approved without a required 30-day EIS review period. An affidavit notarized by a deceased party. An internal email explicitly advising staff to fabricate compliance language after permits were already granted. These are not accidents. They are coordinated procedural subversions. Rothman rose slightly in his seat, just enough to suggest objection. I didn't pause. "What we are asking," I said, "is not punishment. Not speculation. Simply this: that the court acknowledge the legal inconsistency in how these permits were granted and apply the same standard of scrutiny that would be applied to any citizen or small business attempting to skirt regulation. Coastal Dominion is not above procedure, and its legal counsel should not be allowed to profit from patterns of erasure." That word, erasure, hung in the air. It wasn't a legal term. But the judge didn't object. He just wrote something in his notebook. Rothman stood for rebuttal. "Your Honor, the petitioner's advisor has a personal interest in this case, one that has not been fully disclosed. Her birth mother, Anika Rao, was involved in illegal protests against Rothman logging in the early 1990s. That relationship, and her failure to disclose it when joining the legal team, should render her participation unethical and any evidence she has presented suspect." There it was. I met his eyes steady. The judge looked at me. "Ms. Sharma, would you like to respond?" "Yes, Your Honor. My connection to Ms. Rao is a matter of biological record, one I did not know until recently. That discovery is what led me to uncover documentation buried for decades, documentation which, I should note, is independently verifiable and supported by nonpartisan government filings and corporate correspondence." I paused. "And respectfully, Your Honor, if my personal connection to past harm disqualifies me from pursuing justice, then we are setting a precedent where only the unaffected may seek accountability." The courtroom fell still. Rothman didn't respond. Not right away. He sat down, slowly. And for the first time since Vancouver, he looked tired. Not defeated, but weathered. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. He said he needed time to review the full body of evidence, standard, but somehow more dramatic in the quiet that followed. As we packed up, Rothman passed by our table. "You're good," he said under his breath. "But you're not the first." "No," I said. "But I might be the last." He gave a soft chuckle. "No one wins in court. They just delay losing. Only if they have something to lose." He stopped, glanced back at me. "You know what happens if this opens the wrong door?" I did. The precedent alone could unravel years of permits, stall operations, cost them millions. It could also expose the government's complicity in enabling those approvals. And more importantly, it would mean Anika's warnings, the ones everyone ignored, would become part of the official record. "I'm counting on it," I said. When he walked away, I felt no triumph. No rush. just a deep, deliberate steadiness. The kind you get after laying bare the truth in a room that finally had to listen. The ruling came down 2 weeks later. No cameras. No press. Just a PDF uploaded to the court's secure server at 9:03 a.m. I read it alone, sitting on the floor of the law office's archive room, between two crates of exhibits that still smelled faintly of printer toner and cedar dust. Motion granted. Not all of it, just enough. The court agreed that multiple permits were issued in material violation of procedural standards and that evidence supports a consistent pattern of regulatory circumvention. The most critical leases were frozen, pending further review. Coastal Dominion's operations would halt indefinitely in 3 key districts. New permit applications would now require third-party oversight. And, perhaps most importantly, the court ordered a formal inquiry into historical land title irregularities dating back to the Rothman merger. There was no declaration of guilt. No handcuffs. No sweeping, cinematic justice. Just language. Precise. Dry. Permanent. We didn't celebrate. Not really. There were quiet nods, a few exhausted smiles, a moment where Sharon handed me a mug of tea and said, "That's the sound of gears shifting." But the office stayed mostly silent, like we knew the forest was still there, waiting to be heard in its own time. I drove up the coast alone that weekend. Past Terrace, past the rivers and sawmills, and the ghost of every policy failure carved into the landscape. I parked just outside the blockade site from 1992, now overgrown, quiet, untouched. No signs. No plaques. Just the wind through trees that should have been gone decades ago. I stood there for a long time. There was no epiphany. No peace. But there was something steadier. A sense of weight settling into the earth where it belonged. Anika had fought for this place, not with fury, but with knowledge. With maps, affidavits, and protest signs no one photographed. She hadn't won. But she hadn't disappeared either. Not entirely. Her name was now part of the public record. Entered into evidence. Cited in a ruling that would be studied by future land claim cases, dissected in legal classrooms, used to shield the next woman who dared to say no before the world was ready to listen. I didn't light a candle. I didn't pray. I just stood under the canopy she once stood beneath and said her name out loud. Anika. That was enough. I returned to Portland quietly, without ceremony. The house was just as I'd left it, still, dust-scented, and stubbornly hers. I unpacked nothing but the folder. It sat on the kitchen table, thick with redacted memos and court orders, beside the 2 birth certificates, one American, one Canadian. Both mine. Both true. There's a strange calm that comes after something breaks and doesn't need fixing. I didn't feel whole exactly, but I felt clear. The woman who raised me had loved me without hesitation. The woman who birthed me had shielded me with strategy. I had inherited both, warmth and precision. And something harder to name, a refusal to look away. I rejoined the firm 2 weeks later. Not because I had to, but because the work still mattered. The first case I took involved a wetland easement violation, small, local, nothing headline-worthy. But as I drafted the initial complaint, I felt the quiet satisfaction of pushing the first domino in a room where most people only notice the last one. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't arrive all at once. It files. It waits. And when no one's watching, it holds.